Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special episode. Psychovid, tripping through the pandemic. This one has been a year in the making in some ways, because we quickly realized that COVID is a big, long, altered state. And we're going to spend the next hour unpacking that a little bit with our two guests. And what is the importance of a metaphor? Because this is what we're doing. We're using the metaphor of a trip, a psychedelic experience, an altered state, to find some sense and meaning in the pandemic. And a metaphor is like an organ of perception. It's something that can offer some guidance to us in demystifying the supremely mind fuckery of the pandemic. And so one thing that we spent the last week doing is watching Adam Curtis's documentary, Can't Get You Out of My Head. And Adam Curtis was saying that COVID has been like a lightning on a dark night. You suddenly saw what's been there the whole time. And a psychedelic trip does a bit something the same. It reveals what's been there a long time. So, Chiara, shall we introduce our guests?
Thank you, Ivan. I'm Chiara. We are broadcasting from Evia, Greece. We are in the same house, so you can see the blue of the roof. It's not an hallucination. We are in a different room and a different router in case the wind is too strong and one of us drop off. Hopefully, the other one is still on. And yeah, I would like to thank everyone listening for joining us on another journey into the weird of the situation or situation that we are living in, and into another experiment in adapting to these new conditions, using the resources that we have at hand. And in this case, we will draw from the knowledge gathered in psychedelic experiences, as Ivan was explaining. And yeah, we will use this knowledge to help us navigate through the altered states of COVID. And for this, we are accompanied by two experienced co-pilots and trip sitters. The first one, she grew up in Athens in Greece, a couple of hours from here. In the 1990s, she moved to the UK to train as a psychotherapist. Now, 26 years later, she now lives in Brighton and she sees her clients. And she also co-directs, together with Tim Reed, the newly founded Institute for Psychedelic Therapy. She co-edited Psychedelic Mysteries of the Feminine together with David Luke and myself. And she just finished co-editing another exciting book called Psychedelics and Psychotherapy, The Healing Potential of Expanded States, together with Tim Reed, which will be released in September 2021. Please welcome the wonderful Maria Papaspiro. Hello, Maria. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you.
The other one, our next guest, he's a Mexican anthropologist specialized in anthropology of mental health. As many people working in the context of psychedelics, his young years were devoted to tripping. And then he became an advocate for safe tripping through harm reduction, and then legal tripping through drug policy reform. He currently lives in Berlin, where he co-founded the Psychedelic Society of Berlin. And he's also a consultant on psychedelic medicine and community building for the Open Society Foundation and the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS. Please welcome the wonderful Gabriel Ametsqua.
Hello, good to see you here.
And I would like to say that it's fairly rare to see a conversation between four people on the topic of altered states that all have Latino or Mediterranean, equatorial, hot-blooded, temperamental vibe. And that's just an acknowledgement that isn't often a representation in this circle.
And so, having said that, we are ready to start, and we will start with one of our favorite things, looking at memes and commenting on them. So please, Ivan, let us dive into it.
All right. The internet has been very gracious for the duration of the pandemic, so that we were the ones who were privileged enough to have digital tools to keep them preoccupied and a roof over their heads during the pandemic. They were also gifted some relief, comic relief in the meme world. We have our first meme that really kicked us off when all of this got started is our COVID in burning house with a very trippy filter you can see it's like our visual systems are vibrating. And we're just saying, this is fine. This is fine. It's all good. Mm-hmm. Then we have lockdown vibes. We have how it started, and there's an image of a very beautifully put together Sailor Moon-esque anime maiden. And then we have how it's going. And we have same anime maiden discombobulated in a very weird, disjointed way. Yeah, it's going weird. Lockdown vibes. Then we have the classic meme of increasing cerebral stimulation. And we have ultra lockdown, which is kind of a simple baseline. We have monster lockdown and parts of the brain are lighting up. We have unstoppable lockdown and there's a fierce white light in the brain. And then we have godlike lockdown where we're shooting rays to all other beings, sentient and not. Because yeah, it's like one big massive trip. Did we mention this? And next up we have, we have Sesame Street because Sesame Street is inherently and intrinsically creepy and psychedelic. So now there's a little girl amidst Sesame Street characters, Big Bird being the trippiest of all. And we have, today is brought to you by the letter C and the number 19. So it must be weird being a kid and watching children's shows while being in lockdown. Something to acknowledge. Kids are tripping hard on COVID. Then we have an image of Sleeping Beauty, who looks like she's K-holing. And it says, me waking up to relive the same day I've been stuck in since March 2020. March 2020 has a weird ring to it now. It does feel sometimes like we're stuck in it. It's 2021 and it's April. All right. Disclaimer, no psychedelics were involved in arriving at this conclusion. Time is an illusion. Only back pain is real. Yep. After being on screens locked up in a room, yeah, back pain is all too real. Then we have the message on top saying, when you're tripping balls in another dimension, but you got to keep up on work emails. And it's like a saint that's high-tech connected to an Apple computer. And there's also some alien saucers just to keep the DMT spirit alive. Day 6, an early meme that came out, first week of lockdown, when the chairs started to look sexy and we see some furniture looking like a hot body part. And then we have a little comic with a young man saying, oh no. And the pillow says, Kyle. And Kyle says, yeah, pillow. And the pillow replies, I think it's awesome you're experimenting with psychedelics. And Kyle says, oh, thanks, pillow. Then he lays on the pillow with a face that has been speaking to him so far and says, I was about to have a bad trip. A challenging trip, he means. And then we have another used motif with the father, 19th century father with children on lap by feet. The daughter asks, what did you do during the corona outbreak, Dad? Dad says, I ate psychedelics like they were the vaccine. The son says, fucking legend. The kids approve. And this is not a meme, but a little picture for all you shroom lovers out there. How I want to be right now and there's some mycelial snuggling happening. Spooning, shrooming, spoon shrooming, sprooming.
That was another great role of memes. And I would like to ask our guests, so which one is the one that you connected more or triggered something in you? Maria, would you like to start?
I really liked the image of the saint that is getting in touch with the UFOs, but has to keep on the laptop and make sure the emails are sent. I love the aesthetics. It's really well made. But it's just sort of, we're getting pulled into these enormous things, but we're just sort of staying glued in our routines and normality, and we have to sort of cut off what's going on to an extent. And the distraction of the screens from the bigger picture.
Yeah, and the need also to keep up with the deadlines and to some level of productivity. So for those of us lucky enough that we still have our jobs and can work from home, this is always the challenge, to keep on being connected to the laptop, as you were saying, while all of that is happening around us. Mm-hmm. And what about you, Gabriel? Which one is the one you liked?
Well, I think I connected a lot with the back pain one. Perhaps because I have a massive back pain, but not so much really about that, but because I'm also a massage therapist. And actually, I've never done as much massages as in these times. Like, so many people have been asking me to come to my studio, to my personal studio, because studios are closed, to have a massage. And for me, it's interesting to see how many people are actually like not only in back pain, but also taking care of their bodies and finding ways of taking care of their bodies. Many people also coming just to tell me like, God, please, I just need touch, I need the possibility of being touched, because I feel isolated. And in a certain way, it has been for me interesting, like exploring these parts of the lockdown as a body exploration.
I fall into that category for sure. I remember when I was touched last. So I guess that takes us back to the beginning, and our trip is taking off. Two essential things that trippers usually either discover by themselves or are told by more senior trippers are that set and setting is hugely important. How do you think COVID has shown us the importance of set and setting as groundwork for a altered state and going through it? Gabo?
Well, it's interesting because the set and setting theory comes from theories of ritual liminality, which is the idea that when we enter into a psychedelic space or in a ritual in a general way, we conform to a liminal process, which is the entrance to an altered space-time process where everything that live in normality suddenly becomes surreal. Everyone who's participating in liminality will lose status. Everyone is the same. We lose a sense of space and time. We are mostly trapped in a new time and space category in which all the rules, all the processes that are normal, they change. So in the ceremonial process and in the psychedelic process, set and setting are part of the liminal procedure of how to deal with the process. And in this way, set becomes, how do we deal with this abnormal state in terms of how we are, like which kind of things we do, how do we prepare, how do we present into the situation, entering in a clean, relaxed state, that you slept well. And these are parts of like the confirmation of like, okay, I need to take care of myself in the previous process because I'm going to enter into an abnormality, and I need to be as focused and as relaxed as possible. I find sets happening a lot. And actually, like when I talk with people during the lockdown, I realize that most of the people who are dealing best the lockdown situation are people who dealt with the lockdown paying attention to the set, paying attention to what they do, how they exercise, how they eat. If something that was in a certain way toxic during the normal times, but you had the bars and the parties and the friends and the whatever to just clean that process off. Now you don't have it. So in a certain way, you need to develop certain processes and certain patterns that change this. So I think the set is amazingly important because it gives us a notion about how to connect with our bodies and our minds in abnormal processes, in processes that confront us, in processes that makes us feel uncomfortable, which is exactly what happens in psychedelics. Like, I don't know, like we have so many techniques to adequate into psychedelic experiences, but most of the techniques are not conformed into only the process of going through the psychedelic experience, but they have a lot to do with the preparation, with the mental preparation. Look, okay, how am I going to deal with this before entering the process? How am I dealing with myself? And then comes the setting, which is maybe even more important, like preparing the space. It's also very influential, like how are we perceiving our space, not only our physical space, but also our mental space. Like, which kind of people do we surround ourselves with? Like, what friends am I seeing in this lockdown process? Maybe I'm not gonna see friends that are, like that bring me conflictive situations or are stress me out. I'm gonna stay like with the friends that I feel safer. Then it's also like, how am I gonna arrange my house? Like maybe cleaning it more. I saw so many posts, especially at the beginning of the lockdown, of people like really putting their house together, like I'm going to build the thing that I was always wanting to build, like my elevated bed or my amazing desk. And, like at the end, the confirmation of the set and the setting as part of this abnormal process is something about control, tells us something about how we need to connect with our processes of control to also find an anchoring, like these anchors that are not going to allow us to ruminate into too much abnormality and weirdness that we can't control and that we enter into a psychotic state, which I think also happens, like in this lockdown, I've seen so many people who lost the experience of the set and setting and who lost their anchor. And then the liminal process became just too uncontrollable, too random, too difficult to predict. And that just created like a massive amount of stress and a massive amount of fear and, yeah, abnormality.
And that's where we have the anime figure in pieces when liminal space gone wrong. Maria, you mentioned also when we chatted some weeks ago, intention and the role of intention in set and setting. Would you like to add a little bit on this?
Yes, well, a bit like Gabriel was saying, we haven't had the time to attend to these things. We haven't had the time to attend to the setting or set an intention. And some of us might have managed to somehow connect with an intention that emerges and wants to become part of that trajectory, that anchoring that Gabriel said about how to hold the experience, not just for ourselves, but for our communities as well. I think that the general collective kind of setting this experience landed on was already very discombobulated, very fragmented, very divisive. We've had a few years of very significant political shifts that have really discombobulated everyone. So we were somehow trying to navigate that when, everything fell apart 10 times more than what we already were trying to deal with. So, the intention, I think consistently, both before the pandemic and now, is how can I make sense of this? How can I manage this? How can I survive this? And how can I communities survive this? This seems to come up again and again.
I mean, one of the main methods for many people actually has been, moving away from the cities. I don't know, like to paradisiac Greek islands and things like that. Yeah. But it's interesting to see how many people are actually decentralizing, like the urbanism processes and moving out to the countryside and kind of like creating new lives, creating new experiences, and in a certain way, not only because, because it's beautiful and it's a reconnection with nature, but also because those are places where you are also feeling much less the intensity. And that reminds me so much about, like the difference between taking LSD in a Berlin club or taking LSD in the, like in the forest. Like most of the people are going to tell you, yeah, like if you want to take in the Berlin club, like maybe it's going to be fun, but it's also going to be stressful and difficult sometimes, while having it, like in the beach is going to be usually pretty easy to manage. And I guess that in a certain way that is also part of the process of intention and of integration. Like, what intention do we have? And I guess that in a certain way, this intention has a lot to do with, being able to cope.
Thank you, Gabriel. Actually, yeah, I would like to keep on talking about this sense of disorientation, confusion, bewilderment, dissolution of boundaries of self, warping of time. These are all elements that are pretty common in any psychedelic experience. So I would like to ask Maria, how does she see these elements playing out in the pandemic?
Yeah, there's been a lot of disillusion on many levels, and a general sense of really, the very structures we would depend on and surround ourselves with, they no longer hold. So in a psychedelic experience, the dissolution of boundaries is accompanied or even supported by the dissolution of the ego. The dissolution of the sense of self. Our ego structures recede, and that's a very tentative, a very fragile process. But it is also the point where our greater depths become available to our consciousness, and they also become available for us to process and heal whatever lies dormant beneath our awareness, beneath what we know. Now, the journey or the trajectory of this journey will depend a lot on whether we are able to surrender to that disillusion and that opening, or whether we rigidly defend against it. And we don't always have a choice. I had someone coming in for a bit of work recently, and he was telling me how he was taking little doses of psychedelics trying to get himself to surrender. But we might surrender for 10 journeys, and then in the 11th, our defenses come up and we don't surrender. So it's not necessarily something that's under conscious control. And what we do there will really matter, will really color the experience and how what will happen in that space. So in the pandemic, in terms of boundaries, it's been really interesting. And I was reflecting after we spoke about the boundaries, because we see two things. On one hand, we see the introduction of new boundaries that didn't exist before, and they're extremely rigid. That's the boundary of don't leave your house, don't attend your loved one's funeral, don't go to work, really fundamental things that support our well-being. And then on the other hand, we have the dissolution of very familiar boundaries, like, things we've relied upon for our everyday life. Our houses have become our workspaces, have become the gym. I really feel for parents that have had to become teachers for their children and navigate two very difficult relationships at once. And I think that has been an enormous challenge. We have time distortion. Some of us feel that time has flown by. Some of us feel that time is really not moving at all. We have the really bizarre disillusion between the political left and the political right. You know, we have all this kind of breakdowns that are happening in the things that we have relied upon. So I think this has made people extremely anxious. It has led to very high anxiety, and it has, you know, even I think you were noting the toilet paper incident that was happening at first. You know, the sort of concrete example of people absolutely shitting themselves and really trying to make sure they've got resources. So one of the most primitive defenses we have for anxiety is something we call splitting, where good and bad are separate, where us and other are absolutely separate. And, you know, it's been a very big political weapon for generations. It's the classic us and them scenario. You're either with us or without us. So the set we arrived with and the setting we arrived with earlier, you know, before the pandemic hit in, which was the erosion of truth, of trust, division, mistrust, all of these things really got amplified in that space. And we show people in that disillusion of boundaries somehow defensively becoming even more alienated on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, we saw people marching around to buy food for neighbors they didn't know. We saw communities really doing some grassroots projects. You know, we have guerrilla gardening at the beginning of my street, you know, some really wonderful things that have a lot of humanity and a lot of compassion. So there's something about opening up to this death and rebirth process, that, you know, that breakdown that will bring something else later on, that I think sharpens some people's perspectives on one end and then sharpens some people's defenses on the other, which again happens in a psychedelic experience. People will come out of this journey sometimes open and vulnerable and tender with new awareness, and sometimes they will come back fragmented, terrified, with all the resources, all their defenses being the only resource they have.
Wow, thank you, Maria. I just wanted to share, it feels really good to hear you speaking, because I have like a feeling of being able to put the X on the map, of making some order in the confusion. So really, thanks for pointing out what happens in an anxiety state, what happens after one is confronted with something that is uncontrollable, that there's also the possibility of more vulnerability and more like breaking down some rigid structures that can allow something new to emerge. Gabo, would you like to add something to this?
Well, just exactly talking about this, you know, like this other position that Maria described about how people become, in their vulnerability state, people become more communitarian. And it made me think about, again, a little bit about the process of liminality, and how in the liminality process, there is this concept that is called communitas. And communitas is exactly this thing that happens where when things become weird, when things become uncertain, and everyone in a certain way loses their status and their differences, because everyone is vulnerable, everyone is naked, you know, like, and this situation creates the communitas, which is this idea that people are sharing through weirdness, through this uncertainty and vulnerability, they are sharing a common reality. And just the fact that you are able to share this common reality, it gives you more ability to cope, but it also integrates you into a new aspect of reality, an aspect of a more corroborated reality, a more kind of like everyone is checking in to each other. And I think for me, this is very valuable, because this is one of the things that cultivated a lot the psychedelic movement, you know, like this feeling of weirdness, this feeling of like, oh, wow, like we are living something so interesting, so different, so apart from the regular reality. So in this communitary process of living it, we share opinions, we share experiences, we learn from that, we become more communitarian and help each other more. And I see this happening like a lot. Also, as Maria said, like the opposite, like many people who are too much into this uncertainty, and, you know, like that, which also happens in the trips, you know, like when you become just, when you lose control too much, then you also become like, I don't want anyone to talk with me. I can't identify with anyone, with anything. I just want to be alone. And then it becomes a problematic experience. So yeah, I think it's super interesting.
So you've all been mentioning weird and weirdness, and I have to tell everybody to watch and read High Weirdness. You can also listen to it on a audiobook, Eric Davis's book that I read just before the pandemic. So I felt like, okay, I'm at least a little bit prepared for the madness of Psychovid. So I wanted to just say that Stangroff talks about non-specific amplifiers, how a psychedelic experience amplifies a lot of things that we don't have control over. But there's one kind of a specific amplifier, and that is our relationship to authority in an altered state. As I think anybody who smoked a joint at 15 will tell you, any sign of police in your high state is going to trigger some pretty intense feelings. And so, Gabo, I just wanted you to dive into this under COVID, our relationship to authority, spread of paranoia, mistrust, how this is manifesting, and perhaps it peaks in conspiracy theories. And we're definitely going through a golden age of a new golden age of conspiracy theories.
Oh yeah, well, that's super interesting. You know, one of the really interesting aspects about the conspiracy theorists, most people who are really like paranoid about this situation and, you know, like doubting everything and being like, no, everything is wrong. And it's interesting how they spread this notion of like, they are controlling us through fear. And I don't think I've seen people more afraid than them. So yeah, I think our relationship with authority in this way has a lot to do with also, like, you know, like I like to do this parallel experience between how we see our politicians and how we see our guides, our facilitators, our shamans, and also like this process of trust, of devoting yourself into the process and knowing like, okay, is that person really capable of taking me through this process? And for me, it has been really interesting to see, you know, like we are now trapped in one lockdown after another lockdown. And most of the people are just saying like, okay, yeah, well, we need to go through this. But many other people are like, okay, so is this really working? Like, are lockdowns really gonna help us to go through this? Or are these guys just improvising answers? And I think this is a very interesting issue because we have been mistrusting governments for so long, and we have been opposing governments for so long and in so many ways, but we also tend to confront these governments, especially like when dark and difficult situations come up. And in this confrontation, it's very normal for us humans to also find a way of saying like, okay, since I don't have, like, this is an emergency, and since I don't have the answers, then maybe I'm just gonna let it go. You know, like I'm just gonna let this authority say what I need to do and just trust it, trust the process. I think this is very interesting in two sides. You know, in one side, it teaches us a lot about our own internal authority. Like sometimes we are like, okay, yeah, we trust this process, but I also need to trust myself. And this happens both in the psychedelic experience and in the lockdown experience, in which it's like, okay, if these guys want me to do this, I'm going to do it. But I'm also going to see friends, you know, like hiding a little bit, making, like 5 friends reunions. And I'm going to kind of like also trust my own authority, because I think this is something that it's important for me. And I think this also happens in the psychedelic experience a lot, like a lot of shamans can tell us, like, you should be maybe sitting straight or following the chantings or not standing up and going outside the room or whatever. But it's also a lot of process of self-knowledge and self-empowerment, of like really connecting with yourself and saying like, okay, these authorities telling me that I should be doing this, but right now I really feel like I shouldn't be doing other thing. And I think it's so important, because in that way, the lockdown process, the pandemic process, is teaching us a lot about how to handle our own responsibilities and how to grow ourselves. And this is also a process that is very encouraged in the psychedelic world. Like, many shamans are going to tell you, I'm just here to serve. I'm just here to attend a situation, an emergency situation. I would make a parallel there, like according to health services, for example, like a good government. I was thinking about, New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, like saying like, okay, I am gonna, like, I remember that Jacinda, she, when 6 people died in New Zealand, and she personally communicated with the people like, hey, I am so sorry. We could have done more for the person who died. I'm really sorry. We are here for you. And this is what a good shaman does, or what a good facilitator does, or even like what a good trip sitter does. They don't interfere or infer the process. They come to you in terms of compassion, necessity. They are trying to handle the process like, okay, we have this amount of health services, we are just managing this, and then you have very intrusive governments who are like, I know what to do, you're in a massive lockdown, we're going to close all the clubs and restaurants. And then you are like, okay, is this necessary? Is this not? And then we need to trust ourselves, or sometimes trust the authority. And also in a certain way, we need to also like trust the information that is surrounding us, because then paranoia becomes problematic for ourselves. Like if we start becoming paranoid, like, oh no, the shaman is this shaman is bad, he has bad intentions, he's going to damage me, then you just come into a massive bad trip, which is also not the necessary thing to do. Like if the authorities are putting us in a lockdown, yeah, maybe they don't have all the answers, but it's also not such a good answer and a good reaction to just be like, these guys don't know, let's go off the streets and burn everything, because that's just a massive conspiranoic attitude of paranoia that is damaging more the process. So I think it's really interesting to understand these balances, like self-trust, trust into the authority, but also like demanding authority to know how to handle. I think we are in our right to do that, as in, like demanding shamans or demanding facilitators. Like, I really want you to know what you're doing and not just promote yourself like, oh yeah, I'm a great politician, or I'm a great shaman and I know exactly what to do. When most good politicians that are acting in this situation, they are accepting, we don't know, we don't have all the answers, and that's good.
And that's already the sign of oftentimes also a good therapist that sits with you in the confusion and in the mystery, and then goes and guides you along the way. And maybe I'm overstepping what a good therapist does. Maria, you want to chime in?
I would have no idea.
Great.
But I love the association you're making, Gabriel, between shamans and politicians. It's a wonderful metaphor you're creating there, and you're opening it up well, because it has to do with presence. The facilitator really has to forget what they know, really, and just sit in a very human, very compassionate way, and have humility, as you say. Really have humility about the process and about their place. I'm really intrigued with the distinctions, what a really sharp distinction has happened when it comes to sort of authority figures in the public arena. And we have, on one hand, we have the nurses, and on the other hand, we have the police. And we have the sort of reactions towards the nurses in many countries are extremely positive, extremely loving. It's quite interesting. We don't advocate for them to be paid more. Maybe we want to be cared for free. Maybe there's something in that. And then there's enormous problem with police in many countries. Actually, that seems to be the sort of part of the government that gets the most resistance. And for me, this says that at the moment, people really want sort of heart, care, and love warriors rather than gun warriors. We want people that are warriors and will guide us through, but they lead from the heart and they lead from a place of care, as opposed to rigid, authoritarian, almost disgraceful behavior at times.
I would just want to say you're pinpointing something very revelatory about how we practice politics. And I think if we use some of that energy we do to counter police violence and brutality to advocate on behalf of medical staff, maybe that we would actually enact some of that change. Cool.
Yeah, so talking about medical stuff and, when someone gets to that point, having to go to the hospital and maybe dealing with intense symptoms, we are also confronted with the possibility of death and mortality, which is quite a tough one for modern Western culture. And confrontation with death is, again, something that can come up in a very intense psychedelic experience. So I would like to ask Maria, how does she see this playing in the pandemic, or how does death, confrontation with death reveals, what does it reveal about us in this moment?
It's quite a challenge speaking about death, because on one hand, it's, when we speak to it, we speak about the sort of generality, but of course, on a personal level, it's a very different matter. It has a different quality. But death is always near in many forms on a daily basis, and we continually fail or resist, I think, most importantly, to really notice. It's there's endless endings on every level every day, and if we think about it philosophically, when again, it's that removal from the personal realm, if you like, but it's a force of loss and it's a force of regeneration as well. So while we deny it, I think we deny ourselves very important things. And I think the very denial of death we have in our cultures, from the medical system, from our understanding around euthanasia, our understanding around suicide, how cultures relate to it. I think our denial of death really on a deep level is just a symptom of our misalignment with nature. It's cyclical movements, it's forces of life and death, the dynamic that it holds in what she does. So that kind of denial and disconnection we have from death, I think, is a very short-term solution so that we can get on with our lives and get on with things. But on a long term, again, I think it brings great misalignment from the very vital things of life. And it really doesn't help us sharpen the way we relate to ourselves and to the world that we live in. So in the psychedelic community, the idea of ego death is a very familiar concept, at least in talking. We talk about it a lot, and it's it's quite valued as a process. And the idea of ego death just holds the concept of something coming apart. Something somehow, a bit like the girl in that comic book, in that meme that you shared. But that's a coming apart that is in service to a later coming back together. It's not just the coming apart suspended in time. There's an understanding in the psychedelic community that we come apart, but that's because, we might come together in a way that holds more complexity, more alignment, more intelligence in its new form. So it's by no means a very pleasant transformation. You know, transformation is meant to be primarily a painful process. And the death we talk about in the psychedelic ego death is a partial, it's a metaphorical death rather than a literal death that we have been looking at through this pandemic. Although I think there's metaphorical deaths that are inherent in this process we're going through. But the primary death that the pandemic has really put us up against has to do with our physicality, and it has brought to the surface the relationship we hold with it, both as individuals in our own lives, but mostly as a collective, as societies, as cultures. How we talk about it, how near we get to it, how quickly we distract and turn away from it, how much terror there is when it comes to the surface. So the process of death and potential rebirth, because we have to hold rebirth as a possibility when we come apart, a possibility that might or might not be realized. But it's really the deepest language of initiations that we have held throughout cultures, throughout history, that process of crossing a threshold and letting go of who we were and opening up to what we may become, opening up to something emergent, something that's possible. So it involves a painful separation when we cross the threshold of an initiation. It involves a letting go. It involves negotiating a new sense of self. It involves grieving what has been lost or what we've had to separate from. But it is in that crossing of the threshold, you know, that place of separating that's painful and tender and raw, where our resources come to the surface. It's when we meet our suffering that resources we never knew we had in our psyche get activated. They come to our rescue. They come to meet us. In this basis, you know, at some point we do get met by something that has answers, solutions, resolutions that might be very hard to intuit with a linear mind. And psychedelic experiences have a way of bringing that in very creative ways and functions. So, you know, how do we grieve is one of the questions you have put. How do we grieve? And I don't think there's a real answer to that. You know, I think it's about sitting with the pain of the process, with what is being lost, really being very present in that process and midwifing little by little whatever steps ahead we can just intuit.
Yeah, wow, Maria, this is really like some of the core of this experience that we go through on the pandemic. And I would just like to mention, when we grieve, that we become aware also when we confront this new approach to death of understanding the cycles of nature and understanding that modern Western culture has been so removed from nature and so removed from the naturality of death and coming to a new acceptance of it, while at the same time also becoming aware that when we use this narrative, we don't want to incur into the other narrative that says, okay, lots of people died, it's what it is, you know, to become aware that many of these deaths could be avoided because we live in systems that oppress certain categories of people. And so we have also to make distinctions and to be aware of what we say and to what we are talking into. So I don't know if Gabo would like to add anything on this.
Well, only that, actually, what you said is incredibly important, and it's also related to rebirth, you know, like this is not about allowing death, it is about accepting death. And I think it's two very different processes. Like if we like as a society, we do have a responsibility to fight for the lives of the people who are struggling in this process. But we also need to learn a lot about how we grieve, about how we accept death, and about the role of death in our lives, because that's exactly the psychedelic experience pattern. Like when we metaphorically die in a psychedelic experience, we learn so much about how to become a new pattern through the acceptance of letting these parts of ourselves die. And in a certain way, it's about this, like, is this pandemic an possibility to observe all aspects of ourselves as a society die and accept death in a new way, in which we learn better how to grieve, learn better how to feel, how to communicate our feelings, our grief, and evolve and being rebirth, I think that's so important.
And myself being a messed up millennial who processes things through films and animation, I'm remembering Midnight Gospel, the cartoon that came out exactly a year ago in April and was keeping me company in first lockdown. It had one of the best meditations on death that I've seen the last episode of the series. So whoever hasn't seen it, it's a good way to experience it for those of you who haven't been cultivating a relationship with natural cycles and have unnatural cycles with screens. Speaking of, we hear a lot of talk about going back to normal, and that it was never normal. And we hear talk about new normals. So Gabo, what do you think are the main lessons that we can learn from the psydemic experience, and what can we bring into life as it continues?
Well, so many things, I guess, but I mean, I really like to think about this metaphoric position in science, like it is known that viruses are like the main population of living beings attacked by viruses, almost more than 70%, I think, are bacteria. Like most of the viruses in the world are aimed to attacking bacteria that could kill us. Bacteria that develop very fast, that can be very aggressive, that grow their population numbers in a massive way, and therefore viruses come. Hero viruses come and they eliminate or they balance these bacteria so that they do not become too prolific and too dangerous for the balance of nature. So I guess you already catched the metaphor. Like, I mean, I don't want to say that like very Matrix style that we are a bacteria, not a virus. But in a certain way, yes, like we are a massively successful species. We have become massively able to proliferate and to adapt to every environment, to destroy and modify massively environments around us. And maybe we are becoming victims of our own success. And I guess that in a certain way, like this pandemic is teaching us a lot about balance, like balancing. What does balance means? What does, like we have been talking during this chat about what does balance mean? Well, balance positions towards that, balance positions towards weirdness, towards authority, towards ourselves and our surroundings. Like it is about creating environments that are healthy, because this is what helps us go through the process in a healthy way. And I guess that this can also become a global process as a society. Like we hear this thing a lot, like we hear it in the occultist sciences, like as above, as below, and I guess that we as individuals, what we're experiencing as individuals in the terms of how to remain healthy, how to be more connected to our environments, how to be more connected in a healthy way with our friends, with our relationships, with death, with pain, with solitude, All these things, I think we can also apply them as a collective, as a collective being, like following theories that we are all one, that we are just, like mushrooms, like we're just the reproductive system of a massive being. Well, maybe in a certain way, if that's true, then we, as a whole being, we are just being confronted with an opportunity to rebalance things, like to live much more balanced reality, healthy realities, connected, acceptant, empathic, compassionate, caring, and communitary. And in that way also, I would massively invite everyone who's listening to us to avoid notions of paranoia and conspiracy, because they hurt us more, like this idea that, oh yeah, like we have these huge powers that know exactly what they are doing. Like when have governments knew what they are doing? Nobody knows what they are doing. Everyone is acting from a very disorganized way, from a very disorganized perspective. And actually, this may be an opportunity to learn how to act in a more organized and collective environment, in which we really take care of each other, instead of being like me, I'm gonna just be famous and successful and huge and massive, and then fuck everyone else, and then exactly this happens, like we just become in lack of control of proliferation, because we're just thinking about ourselves and our success, and instead of thinking of what the community needs, what the environment needs, what the planet needs. So yeah, I would say that this is a huge opportunity of reflection, of not going back into a new normal, but creating a massively non-normal reality, which becomes a new horizon of abnormalities, like abnormalities reacting to the particularities of each culture, of each ambient, of each necessity, in a way that it's healthy, connected, and harmonic.
Thank you, Gabriel, for this vision of harmony for the future. We need this kind of positive, images that can guide us towards wholeness. Maria, what can you say about the integration? How do we integrate all of these, and what can integration look like after such a crazy, weird experience?
Well, integration will take time, and it always does, and it's an ongoing process, and it will require our communities. It will require our communities that will keep us nourished, safe, and accountable in the process of finding a way to accommodate into our lives what we have discovered. As Gabriel said, the questions of what kind of species were we supposed to be? What have we become? What do we need to do next with where we are? So, a psychedelic trip and a COVID trip will bring our deepest wounds and traumas to the surface, and they will allow us a chance to really work with what requires our attention. And the COVID pandemic has showed that our connection to nature has limits us in significant ways, and threatens our survival and threatens the survival of our planet. And the systemic inequalities and imbalances that we maintain in our societies and in our communities are also part of our shadow. So again, a psychedelic experience and COVID will bring the shadow to the surface, and the shadow is, of course, our colonial, cruel, extractive past, where we've learned to take everything we want and everything we need for our own needs, and not really recognizing we're part of endless ecosystems. So, what has been unearthed is really our collective wounds, our traumas, and all we can at least understand at this point is that we are a deeply traumatized species. Most of it is self-inflicted. Most of it is ones we have inflicted on ourselves as a species, and we cause havoc out of our woundedness to all the ecosystems that are around us. So integration will be really about finding a way to keep looking at that shadow, keep finding a way to address what it holds, and returning to reciprocal relationships, from the smallest scale to the larger scale. It will be a very uncertain process, but we have to follow the mystery and we have to follow our hearts.
Oh, thank you both for this trip within a trip within a trip. I'm going to try and do a quick wrap up of some of the things we've touched on. So we started with our one big extended metaphor of the pandemic as a psychedelic experience. And then we had sub metaphors of shamans and politicians as trip sitters, facilitators, the comparison between political figures and psychedelic guides. We also had the comparison between ego death and the psychedelic experience of death versus actual death that is both happening within our families, but also in this weird digital abstract way on screens. We touched on ritual liminality and how when we enter this huge, wide, global ritualized space, we enter this strange in-between. And in order to navigate it, if people had taken care of set, how they are inside, what they've been eating, have they been exercising, have they been taking care of themselves, have been addressing their shit with a therapist or a group or whatever, they've been much better prepared to deal with the Psycovid shitstorm. Setting as well, those who've been lucky enough to be in a setting that is conducive to calm and a feeling of control over certain variables had an easier time than those who have no control over the variables, since the variables got out of control at a global scale yet again. Then we touched on disorientation, discombobulation, time warping, the not knowing left and right politically, getting more convoluted than ever. We saw our ego structures recede, and it's important to know that this is a process of exposed fragility, and that this is something that we just need to also sit with and allow for. While the whole trip is one non-specific amplifier, there are some specific amplifiers, like our relationship with authority that has been strained at best and has revealed a lot about how we practice politics, in that we have not been so supportive of healthcare workers, even though we've just been patting them on their backs or clapping on our balconies, yet we've been very conflicted with the police, which is, let's hold the silver lining to both of these things, where we can improve and what we should continue doing, i.e. continue protesting police brutality, but then find ways to politically support healthcare workers. We're confronted by death and the ways that we grieve. What is the role of death in our life? Maybe if we find ways of calling that in and sitting with it and experience death, the ego death in a psychedelic state, we might find answers on how to live better and how to live together. Also watch episode 8 of season 1 of Midnight Gospel for more on this. And and all of this is one big opportunity on how to reorganize all of our systems, how to create healthy environments, how to address the massive collective shadow of our colonial extractive past, and recognize that we're part of layered ecosystems and that we're just wreaking havoc from our woundedness. So we need to keep on looking at that shadow and return somehow to reciprocal relationships, great and small. And or just wonder, are we just the reproductive system of one massive being? Look up Candida yeast cults before going to sleep tonight.
And on that note, I would like to thank the speakers, our guests, so much for sharing their wisdom and their knowledge with us and helping us to navigate the altered states of COVID. I would like to thank Maria. Maria, was so great to be with you and share with you this new experience. And
thank you. So good to be with you. Nice to see you, Ivan.
And I would like to mention now, we will put in the comments a link to Maria's talk in Liminal Village in 2014 on the feminine principle and psychedelics, very important talk. Even after quite a few years, still extremely relevant. And also we will put the link to her blog, Towards Wholeness. Check it out. And Gabrielle, great to share this space with you from Berlin. Thank you for making time in your busy life to be with us. And also for Gabrielle, we will share in the comments some links to the Psychedelic Society in Berlin, but also to a project he's doing with Chakruna on masculinity in the psychedelic community. Thank you, Gabrielle, for doing this work and for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Kira, and thank you so much, Ivan. I love talking with you. You're amazingly fun.
And yeah, thank you to the Boom team for keeping on supporting us in many different ways and allowing us to make this happen, to keep on exploring, journeying through the weirdness of what we are living. And please keep on checking also the rest of our content, the Boom Toolkit for COVID-19, the other Liminal Podquests, more will come soon. And thanks to Unite, the project that keeps on sharing our content and keeps on helping us to spread the word and to reach as far as we can. Thank you, guys.
And in the name and in the words of Uncle Terrence, take it easy, but take it. Thank you.